Hi everyone, welcome to the Garden Park Fossil Area. I'm Andrew Smith, a paleontologist with the Bureau of Land Management. And a big part of my job is educating people about the Garden Park Fossil Area and the dinosaurs that have been discovered here. This site has been an active dinosaur quarry since the 1880s, and every few decades there's new major discoveries. Right now we're standing at the Cleveland Elks quarry, which was part of an excavation in the 1950s. The Garden Park Fossil Area sits in the Morrison Formation, which is a geologic formation from the Jurassic period, which was 155 million years ago. So the Morrison Formation is famous for its red and green mudstone beds. They're abundantly clear on the hills behind me here. The green that you see is typically from where the water was covering the sediments as they were being deposited, while the red is where it was exposed to the air. The iron in the sediment reacted with the oxygen and gave it that red hue, the same way that rust forms. The mudstones here were deposited along the banks of meandering streams that flowed throughout the landscape, while there's also sandstone layers that represent where the stream channels actually flowed. There's also a few limestone beds from large lakes that were throughout the area as well. The Morrison Formation covers an area from as far north as Canada to as far south as New Mexico, and stretches from Nebraska in the east to Utah in the west. In most of that area, it is covered up by other formations, but where it is exposed, you tend to find a lot of dinosaurs. Garden Park is one of the major Morrison Formation sites, as well as places like Dinosaur National Monument in northwestern Colorado, and Picket Wire Canyon dinosaur tracks in southeastern Colorado, and the Cleveland Quarry in Utah. In the hills behind me here is where the Cleveland Elks excavation took place in the 1950s. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History, like many museums at that time, were looking for a giant dinosaur to put into their new dinosaur exhibit hall. They sent out a team of undergraduates and high schoolers throughout the West to look for as big of a dinosaur as they could find. Edwin Delfs was an undergraduate zoology professor who led a team of high schoolers to Grand Junction, where they got a tip from geology students from Louisiana. They had just passed through Cañon City and saw a few big fossils sticking out of the rock. That's when Edwin Delfs decided to take his group down to Cañon City to explore these hills and look for their major dinosaur. In this hill right here, they ended up finding a few toe bones and started to dig back further and further, and eventually uncovered a 60-foot-long Hapalocanthosaurus. It's nicknamed Happy now at the Cleveland Museum and is still standing in their exhibit hall. Because this was a group of high schoolers led by an undergraduate student, they weren't the most experienced paleontologists. They used methods that we wouldn't necessarily recommend today, such as using dynamite to blow up the overburden and using mining timbers to hold up the rock shelf as they dug under it. They had a system in place so that any time 4 Mile Creek would flood, the ranchers further upstream near Cripple Creek would warn the ranchers close by. The crew would only have a matter of minutes to haul all of the fossils across the creek before they would be washed away. Even for as inexperienced of a group as they were, they did end up recovering 60% of the skeleton, which is a massive find. Typically in paleontology, you're lucky to find 10 to 20% of a skeleton. So if you find 1 out of every 5 bones, you're doing pretty well. The one piece that they did not find, and nobody has ever found of a Hapalocanthosaurus, is the skull. Skulls typically detach really easily from the neck, and it's a spot that scavengers really like to get at. So the skulls typically will get carried by water relatively easily, and we don't find as many skulls. We'll typically use skulls from very closely related dinosaurs to model the skulls of ones that we can't find, until we do find more evidence of the ones we are missing. We're here at the Marsh Quarry trailhead, and this plaque here was placed in the 1950s by the State Historical Society of Colorado, as well as the Colorado Geology Club. And there's a few things wrong with it. So if you look closely, down here we have Tyrannosaurus. The Morrison Formation here is Jurassic in age, while Tyrannosaurus lived in the Cretaceous. So we won't ever find a T-Rex here, because T-Rex would not appear for another 90 million years. So Brontosaurus is another one that's wrong on this plaque. Brontosaurus hasn't been a valid name since 1905. It's a name that we all grew up with and has been taught in schools, but it's the name that happened to work its way into the public image and into the media before the correct name, Apatosaurus. A paleontologist discovered two very similar dinosaurs and named them two different things. One was named Brontosaurus, which means thunder lizard, and the other was named Apatosaurus, or deceptive lizard. After finding more specimens, he realized that the two were from the same type of dinosaur, and because Apatosaurus was named first, that became the official name. This plaque also shows the variety of museums that the fossils from the Garden Park fossil area have gone to and are currently in. Many of our fossils originally went to the Yale Peabody Museum in Connecticut. Professor Othniel Charles Marsh of Yale University funded expeditions to Garden Park, and whatever was collected during those expeditions went back to him at his museum there at Yale. But then he got a new job as the first national paleontologist with the United States Geological Survey, and therefore his collection then moved to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., where many of the fossil remains from this quarry still exist. Some of them went on display in 1905 and have been on display since then. Other fossils went with Edward Drinker Cope to the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. However, when Edward Drinker Cope fell on some financial hard times, he decided to sell his collection to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So we have fossils in New York as well as DC. There are also ones in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History from the Cleveland Elks Quarry. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science in Denver also has quite a few from Garden Park, as well as the Royal Gorge Regional Museum here in Cañon City. If you decide to come and check out this trail for yourself, there are a few things to know. First, at the Cleveland Elks Quarry, there is a restroom, but there isn't for the rest of the hike. It's a fairly short hike. If you start at the Cleveland Elks Quarry, it's about a half a mile, but you can choose to start at the Marsh Quarry, making it only about a quarter of a mile. However, the last 500 feet is a little more strenuous and pretty steep. There is also cactus all along the trail, so please stay on the trail. And there are rattlesnakes in the area. It is also illegal to collect vertebrate fossils from public lands. As far as BLM lands, if you were to collect any dinosaur bones, even tiny little pieces of them, it's up to $500,000 fine or up to 5 years in federal prison. Even the tiny little chunks of bone are really important for paleontologists. What we call float is tiny pieces that have eroded out of the hillside, and that tells us that we're in the right area, that fossilization was occurring here, and that there are fossils in the area. So typically we use those bits of float to find the bigger pieces. If you do find a fossil, the best thing you can do is to take pictures of it, to write down your location, preferably GPS coordinates, and to bring those pictures and coordinates to the BLM office in Cañon City, right behind the Big O tire. In the late 1990s, right behind us here is where Tony's tree was discovered. Tony was a high school student who was out here on a class trip, and he was looking at the ground and kind of shuffling his feet at something weird he found. He called over the group leader, who took a look at it and identified it as a fossil, but couldn't really tell what it was. So Tony, along with paleontologists, came back to start excavating. They kept digging and eventually uncovered a 20-foot-long tree, the largest conifer from the Jurassic on this side of the Continental Divide ever found. Today you can see that tree at the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, just below the Stegosaurus cast. Garden Park isn't just home to rare fossils, but it's also home to rare plant species, including the Brandigi buckwheat. The Brandigi buckwheat is a small shrub-like buckwheat that only occurs in 50 places in the world, and 24 of them are here in Garden Park. They really like the Morrison Formation and the Dry Union Formation, and they only exist in Fremont and Chaffee counties. Behind me here is the Marsh-Felch Quarry. It was the most productive quarry in the Garden Park fossil area. Excavations here started in the 1870s. Marshall-Felch was a Civil War veteran who wanted to get away from the atrocities of the East that he had recently seen. So he decided to move out west and came here to Cañon City, where he worked a variety of jobs, including being a shoemaker, as well as hauling fruits and vegetables up to the mining camps of Cripple Creek and Victor, until he finally settled here in Garden Park, where he began ranching. While surveying his land and walking about, he ended up finding some large dinosaur bones right here on his property, and he contacted paleontologists to see what he should do about them. One of the paleontologists he contacted was Othniel Charles Marsh of the Yale University, who sent out a team to verify his claims and start excavating. So Marshall-Felch ended up leading a team of excavators that Professor Marsh paid for, and they would excavate out of this quarry here and bring all of the fossils down to the main road, where they would eventually cart them to the train and ship them all the way back to Connecticut. In total, over 250 tons of material were transported all the way back to Connecticut. Once there, Professor Marsh studied the remains and ended up naming 6 brand new species from this one quarry. Those include species of Allosaurus and Stegosaurus, as well as Haplocanthosaurus. There are 2 fully articulated skeletons that came out of this quarry. So articulated is when all of the bones are exactly where you would expect them to be while the animal is alive. So all of the hand bones are right next to the arm bones, right next to the shoulder bones, and it makes it much easier to determine how all of these bones fit together and how the animal lived. This is also exceedingly rare in paleontology. You're lucky to find some scattered bones here and there. So finding a fully articulated skeleton with the majority of the bones still there and intact is a really special occurrence, and there are multiple from this one quarry. If you look at the cliffside here, you can see a big dip in the rock. So there's a green layer underneath that dip that is a mudstone layer, while the chunkier, redder section is sandstone. So what you're looking at is the cross-section of a stream channel. So a stream that was headed this direction dug down and made a pool in the stream, like a swimming hole, and then continued on past that. So the sandstone is deposited in that stream channel, and then the mudstone came from banks of previous channels. So in the layer above it, where you can just barely see some sandstone sticking out of that hillside, is the layer that they were working in. And it was this same process where there was a pool in the stream, but that stream was headed more north-south than west-to-east. That stream channel had this big swimming hole in it where it collected bones that would float down the river, so you'd get scattered remains here and there. Also, during times of drought, that pool would be the last place to dry out, and it would create a watering hole for dinosaurs and other animals to come to drink. And oftentimes they would die next to that watering hole and leave their fully articulated skeletons to be covered up rather quickly. Also, during times of drought, there are a lot more bodies, there are a lot more carcasses, and scavengers can't keep up with the number of bodies there are. So you don't get as much scavenging and bones being pulled away back to scavengers' nests. When you're looking at this map, you can see a major density of bones. They're practically right on top of each other. Usually you're going to find a few here and there, but to find so many together is another rare feature that makes Garden Park really special. If you look closely, you can spot the Stegosaurus, which is nicknamed Roadkill because of how flattened it was, and a fully articulated Ceratosaurus as well. Ceratosaurus and Allosaurus were both theropod dinosaurs, so they had similar body shape to Tyrannosaurus rex, but were much smaller. Ceratosaurus had a horn on the end of its nose, while Allosaurus had two above its eyes. Garden Park is really well known for its Stegosaurus specimens. There have been 3 of the 5 most complete Stegosauruses discovered were here in Garden Park. The first being the Stegosaurus stenops from the Marsh-Felch Quarry. There is also one found about a mile away at the Kessler Quarry, which went on to become the Colorado State fossil. That was discovered in the 1930s and became the state fossil in the 1980s. Then in 1992, there's the small Stegosaurus found in the other direction, over that way. That Stegosaurus was not small at all. It was named after Brian Small, who discovered it, but it actually weighed over 6.5 tons and had to be lifted out of the quarry via Chinook helicopter. So Fort Carson brought in their Chinook helicopter to lift this massive fossil out of the ground and then place it onto a truck. That Stegosaurus allowed us to learn 3 brand new things about the species that we didn't know before, including the neck armor along its under its chin. There were bony ossicles that covered the neck to protect it from predators. The plates along its back were oriented in 2 alternating rows, and then the tail spikes on the end of the tail were pointing out into the back. So those 3 things had been theorized, but this extremely well-preserved and complete Stegosaurus really solidified the case for those three theories. At the same time that Professor Marsh was funding expeditions here at the Marsh-Felch Quarry, just about a mile away was the Cope Quarries. So Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, at first they got along really well. They were great friends who explored Germany looking for fossils together. But soon after they came back to the United States, their friendship took a turn. Edward Drinker Cope had an arrangement with a quarry owner near Philadelphia in New Jersey, where as the quarry owner was mining for glauconite, they were finding many fossils that they would turn over to Cope. When Cope decided to show Marsh this quarry and where he was getting a lot of his fossils, Marsh went behind Cope's back and talked to the quarry owner and convinced him to start sending his fossils up to Yale instead. After that, their relationship continued to worsen and worsen, calling out each other in professional publications as well as in public settings. There was one time where Cope was showing off a new species called Elasmosaurus, where it was a marine reptile, and he had mistakenly placed the head on the wrong end. He had put it on the tail vertebrae instead of the neck vertebrae. And Marsh realized this mistake and confronted him in public during the announcement of this new species that he had made an error. They continued to fight and battle each other for years. And here at Garden Park, it's one of the few places where they had 2 quarries, 2 active quarries, very close to each other. They both had quarries throughout the West. Cope spent a lot of his time in Nebraska looking for fossilized mammals, while Marsh spent a lot of his efforts here in Colorado as well as Wyoming looking for dinosaurs. But they both overlapped in mammals and dinosaurs. There's a lot of stories of having spies in each other's camps, blowing up each other's quarries, blowing up their own quarries so the others couldn't find it. And while a lot of these stories can't be proven, it's very clear that they did not get along and that they did not trust each other either. Cope was awfully brief in his descriptions of new species, sometimes describing entire new species in a simple telegram, while Marsh took a more methodical academic approach to it and would have many, many papers about new species. Eventually, the rivalry led to both participants becoming bankrupt. They used every last dollar they could to find as many fossils as they could. And they even took turns bankrupting each other. When Marsh became the national paleontologist for the United States Geologic Survey, he made a new ruling that any fossils found using federal money belonged to the federal government. And since Cope's expeditions used a lot of federal money, that meant Marsh got to take many of his fossils for himself. And therefore, Cope couldn't sell those fossils. He couldn't study those fossils. So he was left with a very small collection. Cope eventually died in his apartment, surrounded by his last few fossils. In total, Marsh discovered 80 new species of dinosaurs, while Cope discovered 56 new species of dinosaurs. So, as far as dinosaurs go, Marsh won the battle of the most new species. However, Cope devoted much of his time to finding new species of mammals. In the 1800s, when they were excavating here at the Marsh-Felch Quarry, paleontology was much different. First off, the paleontologists didn't like getting their hands dirty, so Marsh never came to this quarry. He only sent a few of his colleagues and sent a lot of money to this quarry. Cope did visit his quarry once, but was ill while he was visiting Colorado, and just briefly made it out to the quarry. Back then, they were mostly going after the biggest fossils they could find, the most new fossils they could find, so they didn't really care about a lot of the smaller things that they were also finding. If you look below that cliffside, you can see a hill that doesn't have any vegetation on it, and that is their tailings pile. So as they were digging, they were dumping all of the tailings off the edge of the cliff, as well as some dinosaur bones. If you find just a rib, there's not a whole lot you can tell from a rib, because there's not a whole lot of attachments, and you can't narrow it down to a specific species. So back then, they were just chucking ribs right off the edge of the cliff. They would also throw a lot of the smaller bones that they would find right over the edge, because they didn't have time to process these really tiny bones. Today, when we are looking at fossils, we also look really closely for the tiniest of fossils, including pollen fossils and seeds, to get a better understanding of the environment. And things like lizards and fish in the area can tell you a lot about what kind of food was available and how the whole ecosystem interacted with each other. Although it hasn't been proven, there's reason to believe that the paleontology technique of using plaster jackets to protect fossils during shipment and during transportation originated here at the Marsh-Felch Quarry. Marshall Felch's wife, Amanda Felch, was a nurse during the Civil War, and she would have had a lot of experience with using plaster to create casts and to help protect people's broken bones. And it's very possible that she applied the same technique here to fossils. It was about this time that that technique developed, and we still use it today. The Garden Park Fossil Area is a unique and important site in paleontology's history, and I hope you have the chance to check it out for yourself. After your hike, if you are looking to learn more and see some of the fossils for yourself, consider visiting the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. If you are unable to visit in person, or are just curious to learn more, check out this website. You can find a link in the video description as well. Thanks for joining me on the hike.